Library of America's community manager, she identifies and develops services, partnerships, and products to support DPLA's national network. Previously, Shaneé was the university archivist and assistant professor at the University of West Georgia, where she led the Community Archives program. Shaneé holds a BA in Religion and Philosophy from Bethune-Cookman University and Master of Divinity from Drew Theological Seminary, a Master of Library Science from North Carolina Central University. As former Director of Library Services and Archivist at Payne Theological Seminary, she curated the Payne Theological Seminary and African Methodist Episcopal Church Digital Collection. Shaneé is past president of the Society of Georgia Archivists and serves on the board of directors of ALTA, formerly known as the American Theological Library Association. Her home base is in Atlanta, Georgia. Audrey is a software developer. She works on many projects, including DPLA's metadata ingestion system, machine learning R&D. Past projects include developing the primary source sets and hub analytics dashboard applications. She holds a Mastery of Library and Information Science from the University of Iowa and an MA in American Studies from the University of Alabama. In her free time, she enjoys studying mathematics and computer science, listening to classical music, and going to theater and playing games with her friends and her very large extended family. Her home base is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Audrey and Shaneé are here to talk to us about the Black Women Suffrage collection and their work with noise cancellation for that collection. We're very excited to hear from them.
Thank you, Penelope. Good afternoon, everyone. Audrey is going to share her screen, but in the meantime, I want to give a thank you to Penelope, who's co-chair of DPLA's Metadata Working Group, for inviting Audrey and I to join you all this afternoon. While we're here, before we start, I also want to recognize Jen Johnson and Evan Struble, who are DPLA's Network Council reps for the Ohio Digital Network Ohio Hub. Before diving into the behind the scenes decisions and the query prep and metadata cleanup for the Black Women Suffrage Digital Collection, and we're calling all of that our noise cancellation. You'll hear why later. We plan to be at the State Library of Ohio eating Buckeyes for DPLA's annual members meeting back in April, but we weren't able to gather in person then. So we're really excited to gather with you all virtually this afternoon to share what we learned curating the Black Women Suffrage Digital Collection. Next slide. Awesome. The Digital Public Library of America empowers people to learn, grow, and contribute to a diverse and better functioning society by maximizing access to our shared history, culture, and knowledge. On DP.LA, patrons across the country, across the world, can discover over 40 million images, texts, videos, and sounds from across the United States. In 2019, DPLA launched a new strategy with an emphasis on uplifting stories from and working with institutions and projects and communities that were traditionally excluded from projects like ours. Recognizing the legacies of racism and white supremacy in member institutions and how that has resulted in the failure to develop collections that are truly representative of the public we serve, the DPLA Network Council began drafting a document to guide the creation of more inclusive and diverse collections as a part of their 2019 priorities. The IDEAS, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Access, and Social Justice Statement, unifies the membership around a clear expression of intent to actively work on closing this content deficit and identify how a national digital library should respond. Even before the COVID pandemic and the global racial reckoning, DPLA had begun to thoughtfully and critically examine what it means for our organization to support access and inclusion. We've seen over the past year that when we strive to put equity and inclusion at the center of our work, the work itself is enhanced. We're better able to serve our community and advance our mission, and our brand is naturally strengthened as a result. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Awesome. Further embodying that work that DPLA is doing is intentionally spotlighting the stories of African American women in voting, and how Black women's history of activism has laid the groundwork for some of the activism we're seeing make an impact today. The Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection, which launched last month on September 8th, is a new dedicated DP.LA website featuring original, contextualized content powered by funding from Pivotal Ventures. Pivotal is an investment and incubation company created by Melinda Gates, and we're really, happy to partner with them and receive support and be able to work within their portfolio of partners to get the word out about DPLA for a more public audience. I'll share more about that later. The project provides digital access to materials documenting the roles and experiences of Black women in the women's suffrage movement, and more broadly of women's rights, voting rights, and civic activism between the 1850s and 1960s. So we expanded the Black women's suffrage timeline in both directions, and we're capturing in this site a long Black women's suffrage movement. The Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection is also, in addition to providing this longer span of history, it's an opportunity for DPLA to work with cultural heritage institutions outside of our network. We've had new partners at the Atlanta University Center, Robert W. Woodruff Library, Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture in Charleston in South Carolina, Tuskegee University, the Amistad Research Center at Tulane, and Southern California Library received sub-grants up to $25,000 to support new digitization, metadata creation, and remediation for project partners. And I want to share that the Amistad Research Center and Tuskegee University are both, they're in Alabama and Louisiana, which do not currently have DPLA hubs. So as a part of this project, we're providing a new pipeline for institutions that are outside of the hub network to still contribute to DPLA. The content featured in the collection explores linkages between women's suffrage and other social causes of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Hence why we expanded that timeline to include anti-slavery, anti-lynching, education reform, and civil rights, as well as racism within the suffrage movement. By extending to the mid-20th century, the project helps dispel the notion that all women successfully secured their voting rights during the adoption of the 19th Amendment. Indeed, for Black women, the struggle to vote and to effect change through civic engagement more broadly did not end in 1920. Their stories add new shades of context to related topics in our nation today, from the suppression of voting rights based on race and gender to the increasing number of women of color running for and winning elected office. And now I'll turn it back over to Audrey to talk a bit about the technological components of designing the Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection.
Hi, thanks, Shaneé. All right. So one of the main goals of the Black Women's Suffrage Project is proportional representation and bias correction. And if you look at DPLA, even with all of the new material that we've been able to collect for the Black Women's Suffrage Project, we have tens of millions of items in our collection, and within that is, of course, this really rich trove of items about the stories of Black women. But like many digital libraries and many libraries in general, the majority of our collection is described by men and white people. So the project really aims to surface the stories of Black women and to make them more accessible through a new discovery interface. But given the nature of our collection, this is no small challenge. So the technologies that we use for this project, we knew going in we're going to play a crucial role in our efforts towards proportional representation and bias correction. And throughout the field of digital libraries, I think there's been increasing awareness about this conversation and how technologies impact issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this project was a really great opportunity for us at DPLA to practice and learn about this kind of intentionality in our technologies. So the functional goal of our technology was, of course, to select materials from the entire DPLA collection to be tagged and included in the Black Women's Suffrage collection, and then to make those available in a web portal. But equally important to that functional goal was this additional goal of supporting representation and bias correction. So when I reflect back on our experiences as a team and what we've learned, these 4 principles sort of float to the top for me as things that were really guiding principles for us in this process. And that was to make our technologies legible, accurate, responsive, and collaborative. By legibility, I mean that all of the project collaborators, both the technologists and the curators and the metadata specialists, everybody involved, could see and understand why individual items were included or excluded from the collection, and to understand and to be empowered to make changes in that selection process. Accuracy means that we faithfully modeled the curatorial concepts so that the collection includes and excludes all of the appropriate materials. And responsiveness means that we are continually on the lookout for ways to expand inclusiveness and weed out bias, and that we can make changes to the collection quickly and effectively. And finally, collaboration means that people with specialties in technology, metadata, and the subject matter can share information and work together to solve problems. And I want to stress how important collaboration really was in this project, because we needed to have all of those experts in all of those different fields really working closely together and communicating through the entire process in order to make it happen. So I'm going to give a sort of a technological overview of the project, and I'm going to highlight examples of these 4 principles at work. And then Shaneé is going to dive into some of the more nitty-gritty details about our collaborative process and what we learned about the curation along the way. So to start out, I want to look at our ingestion architecture, which some of you may be a little bit familiar with. So as you know, DPLA aggregates metadata records from dozens of hubs across the country. And the first step in our process is this ingestion 3 application, which fetches the records. It does some processing to make them align with DPLA metadata standards, and then it saves them to a data source or a data store. And in our case, the data store is just a dump of flat files on an Amazon S3 server. So then every week, we are re-ingesting a few hubs, and we are updating our data store with the new records. And at the end of each week, we run our indexer application, which re-indexes our complete data store. This is a computationally expensive job because it requires us to process and to touch all 40 million of our records. But we're able to do it on a weekly basis because we use cloud and cluster computing, which basically means that because we have a cloud of servers that we choose, we have a lot of computing power. And second, the cluster computing means that we're basically taking the task of processing 40 million records and dividing them up into hundreds of different little chunks. And then each little chunk is processed all at the same time. So that's why we're able to do this big computationally expensive thing at the end of every single week. And then finally, excuse me, we put all of our engines into the search index, and the search index powers our API, which is served over on the web, and then the DPLA website, our flagship website, and then some additional websites read from that API. So in order to integrate Black women's suffrage into this process, the first thing was in the indexer job, when we're processing all of our 40 million records, we added a step where we tag the records that belong in Black women's suffrage. So we had to create an algorithm that would determine for us whether each record should belong in Black women's suffrage or not, and then to give it a tag. And then when a user does a search on the Black women's suffrage website, we use that tag as a filter so that the search results only include things that have been tagged as belonging to the Black women's suffrage project. And this architecture helps us to be responsive. We have our algorithm that decides what belongs in Black women's suffrage and what doesn't, and we can change that algorithm at any time. And then within a few hours, those changes are reflected on the live website. This is really important for this project because, with 40 million records in DPLA and then about 200,000 in the Black women's suffrage process or project, it's not possible for any human to individually vet all of the records. So we're expecting that we're going to learn things about the composition of the collection as people are using it and as we use it ourselves. And also because we have new materials coming into DPLA every week, there's always going to be new content to capture and new noise to have to contend with. So we are expecting that we're going to be making regular and continual changes to our algorithm in order to keep the composition of the Black women's suffrage correct. Okay, so I've said the word algorithm a couple of times in order to talk about this process of deciding what belongs in Black women's suffrage and what doesn't. So I want to talk about the algorithm a little bit. What we essentially have is on one side, we have a metadata record, and on the other side, we have some curatorial concept. And we need to decide if there's a match between the metadata record and the curatorial concept. And there's a lot of different algorithms that you could use for this. The thing that we really cared about, well, one of the things we really cared about was the concept of legibility. What we did not want was some sort of an opaque system where the machine was making decisions about what belongs and what doesn't belong, and the humans didn't really understand how the machine was making those decisions. What we wanted instead was a system where humans were very much in the loop and were able to exercise a lot of control over the selection process. This is especially important in a project centered around diversity, equity, and inclusion because, of course, humans are able to understand complex and sensitive social issues like racism and representation that computers just can't account for. And we also wanted something that our curators could actively collaborate on. So again, legibility was a very important part of our decision. So what we decided to use was a search engine and Boolean logic in order to make this selection happen. We basically crafted a huge, glorious, multifaceted set of Boolean queries that we could run against all of our metadata records. And this system of using a search engine and Boolean logic allows the humans in the project to exert a lot of fine-grained control over the process and the ability to make very specific tweaks to the algorithm. And it's also a really natural workflow for our curators who are already using the DPLA search index in order to construct queries and do keyword searches to find out what sorts of materials were available to us and what sorts of themes were really fruitful in the collection. So let's look closer at this process. So we're starting out with our metadata record on one side and our curatorial concept on the other. And starting with the metadata record, the example here is Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. So this is a short record, we're just gonna look at the title. So what happens is the search engine takes the text of the metadata record and breaks it down or analyzes the record. And what it's doing here, you can see it's stripping out what are known as stop words, words like in, the, and of that don't really tell us what the record is about. It takes words like scenes, and it's a plural word, and makes it a singular word, and that's so that documents that have different variations of the same word can match to each other. It's stripping out punctuation, it's downcasing. There's a lot of sort of tweaks you can make to the system, but this is an example of sort of a basic way that a search engine would take a document and break it down so that it could be matched against a query. All right, so on the other side, we have our curatorial concept, Harriet Tubman. The first step is to make a Boolean query that can represent this concept. Here, I'm just, for the sake of this, I chose a very simple one. So we're gonna look for the words Harriet and Tubman in the document. And then in the exact same way that the metadata record was broken down, the search engine is gonna break down the query. So it's downcasing it, stripping out any punctuation you might throw in there, stuff like that. And then finally, you can look and see if there's a match or not. And since our metadata record contains the words Harriet and Tubman, the search engine knows this is a match. The last step is that we tag the document. So this document would get the Black Women's Suffrage tag that indicates it belongs in the collection, and then it also gets the Harriet Tubman tag so that we can easily understand why this particular document was selected for inclusion. Okay, so in order to make this actually work in our system, to integrate it into our indexer application, we used an Apache Lucene search engine, which is separate from our Elasticsearch engine. Oh, and for those of you who don't like looking at code, this is the only slide with code on it, and it'll be over with really quickly, so just bear with me. Lucene, Apache Lucene provides a Java package that basically sets up a little search engine in your runtime environment that can match a query or a set of queries against a stream of documents. So to walk through this little snippet, the first line of this, where it says class monitor holder, etc., that is defining a container class, which is going to allow us to distribute this process across the cluster, which remember is what allows us to run a whole bunch of jobs in parallel and get this done in a timely fashion. And then you instantiate a Lucene monitor, which handles the stream of records. And we instantiate a query parser, which handles the Boolean queries. We put the query into the monitor, and then as the indexer is processing through our stream of 40 million records, it's sending each one through the monitor, which is going to try and do the match against the query to see if it matches or not. And then after it gets this process of going through this little mini search engine and getting tagged, then we publish it to the Elasticsearch engine, which is our live search engine that powers the API and that people can access and search. Okay, code part is over. So now I want to talk about the actual query that we're writing, this big Boolean query. We affectionately call it the big query, but in actuality, it's actually, it's a set of over 100 individual little queries. And each of these little queries is trying to model a single curatorial concept, which might be a person like Harriet Tubman, it might be an organization, a publication, a social movement. So those are the sorts of little queries that are making up this one big query. And it turned out to be pretty challenging to model the curatorial concepts in query language. Just to give you a sense of the scope of our query, the background image of the slide is actually in teeny tiny font, the entire full text of our query as it currently stands. So that is how big the query is. All of the little sub-phrases and if else, not, and or bits are in that big background chunk. All right, so some of the challenges were handling variations in the metadata. As you can imagine, with over, gosh, how many hundreds of individual libraries and museums and archives contributing to the DPLA. There's a lot of different standardized vocabularies that are used. There's a lot of different conventions that are used. So we kind of had to contend with all the different variation in there. We also had to try to find as many relevant items as possible. And this again was really important because a lot of the people and organizations that we were trying to highlight in this collection are historically underrepresented. So there might not be very many documents available even for some of these concepts. So we really have to work in order to make sure that we're getting as many of them as we can. And we also had to work to exclude a lot of noise, and Shaneé is going to talk in much more depth about this, the noise cancellation process in particular. So I'll just say, to give a little precursor to what Shaneé is going to say, when you're in a situation where a concept like the suffrage movement has so many documents that are going to be about white women, you have to be, the concept of noise takes on a bit of a different meaning in this concept, because things can literally be relevant to the collection, but if we were to bring in too much of it, then it would drown out the stories of the people that we were actually trying to highlight, because there's just, you know, way more documents about Susan B. Anthony than there are about Harriet Tubman in the DPLA. So we have to deal with that sort of a nuance in the collection. All right, so anyway, this is what I'm trying to drive at here is this concept of accuracy, where in the context of equity, diversity, and inclusion, accuracy takes on a new and really important meaning because of the types of voices that we're trying to highlight are not ones that are naturally highlighted in the collection, so we can't be lazy. I just want to sort of point this out real quickly. This is the actual logic of the Harriet Tubman query. It's a little bit more complicated than just saying look for Harriet and Tubman. We learned along the way that we had to be a little bit more detailed in the way that we represented these concepts. So what we're actually looking for in the current iteration of our query are the substrings Harriet Tubman, Tubman Harriet, Harriet Arminta Tubman, and not Harriet Tubman Women's Shelter, Harriet Tubman Senior Center, Harriet Tubman House. There's a lot of this actually when you're dealing with famous people. A lot of things get named after them, and you have to be wary of that when you're trying to find information about them, that you don't necessarily want all of the things that have ever been named after them to be included as well. And then the individual fields to search in within the metadata record also showed up as being important. So here we're looking in the title, creator, or subject field. That was another thing that we needed to be mindful of, was where we thought these keywords were going to show up in the records. And finally, we have done a lot of automated reporting as part of this. So this is here as an example of a report that gets generated every week. And that says in the left-hand column is the different tags that we have in the collection, and in the right hand is just the number of documents that are associated with each tag. So this one helps us to sort of keep track of the shape of the collection and what's in there. We have other reports that tell us all of the new documents that have come into the collection. We created a reporting script that you could submit any individual document and get back detailed information of how and why it was matched or not matched to the collection. So we have a lot of different types of reporting so that we can sort of continually monitor what's going on in the collection. And this was really helpful in the curation process. We created some additional documents for the curation process, like we would dump out all of the individual unique subject terms that were represented in the collection. So we kind of scan through it and say, you know, oh, these terms look relevant, but then something would pop up that was a little bit weird, and we'd like dig around and see, well, you know, why are we suddenly getting documents about neuroscience in this collection? Is this really relevant or not? So those kinds of reports were really helpful. And the reporting hit all of our principles. That helped us to be legible because it helps us to see what's going on and the impact of our algorithm on the outcome. It helps us to be accurate because we can check our work basically. And responsive, this is a big one because if something weird starts to come up, then we can know about it and change it. This is a way of us to sort of continually monitor what's happening as our collection changes over time. And finally, I think the biggest one is that this really helps us to collaborate with each other because, you know, I can't take coding language to a group of curators and have a good conversation about what it means, but I can take a report of what that coding language has resulted in and talk to the curators, and we can have a good conversation about what it means and if there's things that, that we need to change. So that's it for me, and I'm going to pass it back to Shaneé to talk about our noise cancellation.
Thank you, Audrey. As Audrey shared, each institution or contributor shares the materials with DPLA according to their own specific policies and objectives. And as part of what we called a noise cancellation party, DPLA staff, which was myself, Audrey, and At Williams, who is our communications coordinator, who's had a deep background in producing for the History Channel and doing a lot of content and subject specialty in history. We dedicated time to gather together to search and collect subject terms or keywords related to Black women's suffrage. And from looking through those results to further winnow the relevance. And I came up with the name Noise Cancellation Party when Audrey presented to us that the query was bringing back noise. And I thought immediately of, you know, those silent dance parties that have become pretty popular. where everyone has their headphones on and they're jamming out, but if you were in the room, everything is silent. So we wanted to, I imagine us taking all of these different streams of subject and keywords and dancing in a party ourselves, but getting all the content and, you know, making sure that the streams of subjects were in one headphone. So we developed a methodology for distinguishing content about the people we wanted. This included what Audrey shared, intellectual and contextual work of searching for women's names and control vocabulary for the people, the places, and the organizations, including terms that were no longer used. It involved us taking brief notes about characters and relationship and information for context, including checking the Wikipedia pages and finding out who these women were and why they were important to the collection. Behind me, you'll see some of the secondary sources that Kat and I read related to Black women's suffrage. So I do have a background in African American history. Some of the key suffrage bios and other contextual information, I just did not have any expertise in, so we did a lot of review of the secondary sources. So that inherent in that noise cancellation project is a lot of intellectual labor and a development of subject specialty where it did not previously exist. We dedicated this time, so it was labor intensive, it's technically intensive, intellectually and labor intensive. Our noise cancellation parties started in April, and we met regularly, I would say every week or every other week through the end of June. Audrey led me and Kat to apply for our API, and we looked at the query through GitHub, but we were more so providing insight for Audrey to test and tinker and build. The query is updated each Friday with new records pulled from the DPLA aggregation, hence why we needed to meet regularly. And the Black women's suffrage tag was applied explicitly and then later redefined. Next slide. Next slide, Audrey, please. Thank you. We tagged collections via subjects headings for the early query as an effort to pull in what we expected to find about the people, places, and things we already knew. So here you'll have collections that had to do overall with like African American history that we could already define in the larger aggregation. Next slide. Looking at this in hindsight, you can see where it's highlighted. We can see where a lot of the noise came from. There are a lot of collections that were pulled in that were relevant due to them being government records. We had records of the US Food Administration, cemetery records, Bureau of Ships, collections that contained some topical relevance, but they needed Boolean descriptors. And in some cases, they needed multiple phrase Boolean descriptors to further winnow them down. Next slide. This process required we review and keep track of a lot of different spreadsheets. We had some initial organizational terms that we put together, like our first spreadsheet had the Black women's suffrage that we already knew of. We had their names, we had some of the larger topics like civil rights, anti-lynching, abolition. We had some dates. So we took these initial organizational terms and, you know, pulled in results from the DPLA aggregation, but then we further winnowed those down to relevance. And as you can see in that last column, we added some Boolean and not some geographical terms to further winnow down results. And you can see we you know, provided that information to Audrey, and group decided based on what she showed us and what we knew about the subject, whether those candidate terms needed to remain in the query and how they needed to appear to bring more relevant results. Next slide, please. So you all can see where I've highlighted in that aquamarine that some of the super broad terms led to huge data dumps and lots of results for us to cull through, like universal suffrage, abolition, and we needed to add names, dates, and more geographic limiters based on our history, our knowledge of the history of Black women's suffrage. And we learned as we went. Some of the surprising things was that one example is Jim Crow. Like Jim Crow, we know it related to the civil rights movement and its definition that it limits the free movement of Black people during the segregation period. The query process revealed to us that there was also Jim Crow the character, and discovering that leaving the broad term pulled in results related to Tom Rice, who was the white actor who was famous for playing Jim Crow in blackface. And we also learned that since the origins of Jim Crow as a minstrel figure, they could be relevant to the collection. We needed to do further defining what about Jim Crow was relevant to Black women's suffrage. And we learned, like, why was, Jim Crow such a popular name for horses? That is one knot we had to put in the query. We also had conversations around decibels of noise, like what is loud noise? What is noise that we can tolerate and what is just too loud? And in one case, it was white voter. White voter was in the subject for over 6,000 records from the State Library and Archives of Florida. And these were just regular voting rolls. And each person's next to their name, it said white voter. We got a copy of, they looked like voter registration cards. So white voter was a term that we had to absolutely eliminate. Next slide. So iNOR's cancellation, as it got closer to launch, closer to our benchmarks around when we wanted to have this process finished, we ended up doing batch fetch results to randomize iNOR's cancellation. And that was us essentially like putting our playlists on shuffle and testing our work. One error we found was creating historically inaccurate Boolean searches. That's what we began calling them, like Susan B. Anthony and racism. Racism is not a term used when these primary sources were created to describe Anthony's exclusion of Black women in the movement. So racism would be used more in secondary sources, and we tested it and found that Susan B. Anthony and racism found 0 results. So earlier I said that we had to be careful about terms that weren't used anymore. Like we actually had to add in Negro to some searches to get more relevant results. We also had to make sure not to use terms that were too contemporary, like African Americans. That term it didn't become as popular until the 70s. So putting that with like civil rights without a date pulled in things that were a little bit too contemporary. So we had to adjust our scale for contemporary versus non-use, out of use things. And that led us also to ask the metadata working group to build on some of Audrey's work related to harmful language, because we wanted to be able to explain to visitors how the site was curated, how digital library collections are created overall, and how history is told in the portrayal of history. And we also wanted to create a process for patrons who find things that are harmful or that they feel like should not be represented in the site. We wanted to give them a pathway to alert us of that, because while this was a lot of deep labor, we might not have caught everything, and there are some things due to the subject matter that could be difficult to encounter. So we wanted to make a way for that. We were still finding things that were related to suffrage, even with our Susan B. Anthony and racism example. Things that were related to suffrage, but focused on white women, and we were thinking how to parse that. Another example is like the temperance movement. It pulled up 81 results at first, not all of which seemed relevant. So we had to add, well, temperance minus Russia, temperance minus Great Britain, temperance minus Ireland to get the US experience. We had to find a way to slim down voter registration results and civil rights. So in some cases, we did add African American, we did add Negro, we did add SCNC. We also had to find a way to slim down students for democratic society results to get those related to the civil rights movement. Next slide. We also found that name variations for some of the key figures that we had to put in name variations to increase results. So like if noise cancellation is a well-tested hypothesis, like here are the results for our iterations. Shirley Chisholm is a great example. This is a before and after screenshot showing all the name variants. You see that we added in a middle name, changed the order of the words in her name, added years, capitalized, initials. Query expansion, looking at this as an example, is really an exercise to get both sides of the same coin. The noise cancellation ensures that we're not pulling in junk, and the query expansion is to make sure that we're casting a wide enough net, and including multiple variations of Shirley Chisholm's name is a way that we are casting a wide enough net. The latter is important in the context of recovering underrepresented people, because once we realized that we needed to do a query expansion, for example, making sure to query all the variations of a person's name, Audrey was able to pull in about 3 times as much content relating to the people we identified as key to the collection. Next slide. Here's a screenshot of a code change. We refined and expanded the tags here to keep out noisy results. When we did batch results and then reviewed the individual identifiers to test how well we did, and then we found where there was still room for improvement in some Boolean operators. Like here, we added in some more geographic representation and said, no, not Mexicana. We were trying to get to, trying to make sure that we weren't, we were pulling in the Black women's suffrage movement. So we had to add some more tags to make sure expand to keep out in a way. Next slide. Okay, I'll go here and then go back. I think I'm missing a slide. I'll talk about the reception. The initial concept of the Black women's suffrage was designed to celebrate and shed new light for the anniversary of the 19th Amendment. But also, you know, the time and the moment we found ourselves in, we thought has significantly contributed to the reception. We found that over the summer that there was quite an appetite for community conversations about reckoning with history. Folks wanted to contextualize the uprisings of the summer and have conversations that felt empowering to people, and reflecting on Black women's civic engagement was one of those ways to be inspired and encouraged by women of color who were organizing for a long journey to representation. 814 people registered for our September 8th launch webinar, which is the highest virtual DPLA event that we've had thus far. Some of our partners hosted watch parties and reshares of both the collection and webinar recording flooded our inbox. We had increased social media impressions, and we shared artifacts on Instagram and Twitter mostly. I had a slide. I can share this with Penelope later so you all can look back at it. I apologize for leaving that out of the slides today. But I was going to show a snapshot from our Google Analytics from the month of December that I found useful. It wasn't like a huge spike of users, but the information was important to me because it made me curious about where in the site they landed and what was interesting to them and how long they stayed. We did all of this work on creating a timeline and key suffrage bios and making sure that the search interfaced well, but they did not always land at the places we expected them to. The key suffrage and timeline pages were not the most visited. They were the search. So that information is really helpful because, it begs the question, do we need to do more user experience on the site and make it more usable for a public audience? Are there things we need to change? Through the COVID pandemic, we've found that more educators and scholars and the general public is looking online for historical resources. They're just looking for content. Something cool that happened to DPLA on April 19th, CNN mentioned us in an article, which resulted in the second biggest traffic day in the history of DPLA. The first biggest was the launch day in 2013. Thanks to CNN, we want more of this, and we're looking to do outreach to public audiences to get that kind of usage. So looking at the September numbers and thinking about user experience and thinking about how we can put DPLA in front of more public audiences and build for more public audiences is what we're working on through the rest of the year. As part of the partnership with Pivotal, we've been introduced to their collaborators with national platforms. One of those was for a collection called Truth Be Told for their Evoke site. And I'm going to drop that link in the chat. And the Evoke site was a suffrage overview that includes some of the DPLA artifacts. And it gave me the opportunity to connect with a historian named Allison Lang, who did some curating for the Truth Be Told site. And we did interviews for publications like Glamour, Forbes, and the New York Times about putting together digital objects. But it was also, an opportunity to talk about digital collections and DPLA and how to teach with historical materials and, how these Black women's suffrage artifacts can help us reconstruct visibility and create a more just and equitable historic record. As part of DPLA's work, this slide that you see here, advertising our brown bag, we're having a network-wide discussion. It's going to be brown bag, which is pretty informal. It's taking that analytics question a bit further, and we're going to have a conversation about how Google indexes URLs and how the quality of our metadata really impacts search engine discoverability. DPLA is testing some strategies with partners, and we invite you all to join us next month for brown bag on the topic. Next slide. And again, thinking through public audiences, the so what piece. Part of that work is with our Wikimedia Commons project to upload our digital assets, those that are in the public domain, and have rights clearance into Wikimedia Commons so wiki editors can go in and enrich Wikipedia articles with those images. So our next conversation about Black women's suffrage and that builds around access and use in the public will be the Black women's suffrage to Black Lives Matter, a living legacy. And that is a webinar we're partnering with Charlotte Mecklenburg Library and WFAE, which is the flagship NPR news talk station in Charlotte, to talk about Black women's suffrage featuring contemporary voting stories. Again, the so what piece. Together, we'll explore how this partnership, rooted in the local public library, public again, uplifts the stories of Black women and the importance of freedom of the press during uncertain times. And this talk is also going to spotlight Charlotte Mecklenburg's work to collect African-American COVID-19 experiences and photos from the Black Lives Matter protests, and also enrich Wikipedia articles with relevant information for and about the CML community. So again, we're extending the timeline of Black women's suffrage into the present. And that is our presentation. Next slide. I have our contact information here, but Audrey and I would love to hear your feedback and your questions about noise cancellation and query building.
Thank you so much, Shaneé. That was a very interesting look behind the scenes of creating this collection. We do have a couple of questions, and go ahead and drop any more questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll ask them of Audrey and Shaneé. The first question is, how long did it take to get that final version of the Boolean searches in place?
That's a great question. Shaneé, do you remember when we started this? It was months.
Yeah, we started the noise cancellation in April. We didn't finish until the end of June, and then we still went back through July and did a few more review sessions.
Yeah, and I mean, there's still, like, I just found something the other day that I want to do, like another bit of noise I want to cancel out. So yeah, to get, what is that, 2-3 months to get to like a really good sort of MVP version, and then we're still going to keep working on it and tweaking it.
Thank you. A kind of a follow-up on that. Do you have like plans to keep updating or changing this, like planned meetings, because obviously you're pulling in new things every week, or is it just as you find things?
Yeah, I think that's, Shaneé, you might have insight into this as well. I think partly this project is a process of learning the best way to go about things. And so we're not quite sure yet what it's going to look like. We have, I think Shaneé mentioned, we tried to be transparent on the website about what this collection was, and we provided an email address so that users can email us if they find things. We don't know yet if people are going to use that or not, so we're kind of waiting to see if our users want to engage with us on that front. But that would certainly impact the way that we go about things. And we do have reports that are sort of regularly generated that we can kind of spot check. So if anything like super weird happens, we'd probably catch it. Shaneé, what do you think?
Since we have those 6 partners who are providing new content to DPLA for the Black women's suffrage specifically, we've asked those who are coming in through the aggregation to assign Black women's suffrage tags to them. But, I believe, Audrey backed me up, that we'll still have to test to make sure that those items all of them are coming in, and that the Black women's suffrage tag is enough to pull those in.
Yeah, definitely. And we've also had at least one email so far from a contributing institution that learned about the project and wanted to know how they could get things from their collection that were relevant. So perhaps coming forward, the hubs and contributors will want to collaborate with us as well on making our query better.
Thank you. And then we had a question on, for the name variation searching, did you have to intentionally misspell names to catch typos, or how did you find some of those incorrectly spelled names?
That's a great question. Fortunately, I didn't find a lot of typos. So yay, everyone who creates metadata, because that would have made my life a lot harder. What I actually ended up doing was I made use of the DPLA API. With using the API, you know, I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but like getting an API key and submitting your own queries to the API through like a web browser or a curl query, you can do more advanced searching than you can through the website. And since I have to write it, I know how to do that. So I would go to the API and I'd sort of have my Wikipedia page open so I could like check if there are different name variations, or sometimes the curators would provide me with different name variations. And then I would just do searches in the subject and creator fields to like see what came up. And I would do like a facet on it. So I would say, you know, show me all of the different subject terms that include Shirley and Chisholm. And that was a really sort of, I mean, it was sort of time consuming, but it was really thorough. So I think it actually raises a lot of really interesting questions about how we might make this work accessible to somebody who wasn't like me, like sort of an API super user who helped to write the system. So I knew all the like the dirty secrets. It was possible for me in a way that I don't think would be possible for just any curator to do. So I feel like that's like a really rich potential field of development for, you know, not just DPLA, but, you know, for us as a field, if we do more work like this about how to make those sorts of queries possible.
I think so, especially like how to use the DPLA collection to create more of these, like you said, curated searches or other collections. Thank you. Well, we are almost to the end of our time, so we'll go ahead and wrap this up. We have a 15-minute break and we'll be back at 3:15. You can stretch or run around your house, whatever you need to do to take a break and come hear from us again. We're going to have a panel from ODN and then a few more visitors from DPLA. Thank you.
Thank you all.